promised I would give you an example of actor network theory applied to a particular project. I'm going to hope to explain a little bit more about translation. This is a project that Jen Skaggs and I worked on. We used as an example for this project some of the data from Jen's dissertation research that she did on engineering women in engineering. Jen recently came back from being a first dean of students and a faculty member at American University in Cairo, and she's now a visiting professor at Miami University in Ohio. So I'll get right into it. So we purposely talked about enrollment in this weird spelling because we were making sure that our audience understood that we were talking about the kind of enrollment that Michelle Colon and other actor network theorists talk about, and not enrollment just like a registrar's office. We are interested in understanding not only how students come to persist in college, but how they get connected to actor networks on campus, particularly in their academic discipline or major, and how those connections influence their progress to degree. We share the basic assertion of most retention theorists that students bring to college a set of belief and resources drawn from their past, a la habitus or cultural capital, and that these pre-college characteristics affect student persistence. Some of the theorists from retention theory that we think about in trying to look at our problem of how does a student become a member of the social network that is their major, one of which was Leyva and Wenger communities of practice. Leyva and Wenger provide one way of thinking about a newcomer's social integration through their work on community of practice. Mittendorf and Pace talk about learners' social integration in the classroom as decoding the disciplines, referring to the culture of each discipline as a distinct world that needs translation. Tinto and Engstrom have recently argued that we need to break down the bigger campuses by creating smaller learning communities in which students can integrate both academically and socially. All of these theorists recognize that there is a connection between the individual and some kind of social. Actor network theorists inform this work on social integration by questioning what we mean by social. They view social organizations or communities as dynamic, layered systems of actor networks. As we'll see when studying students and community, we need something that looks beyond social integration to some kind of group or campus or subgroup or small community, and instead examine the nested context of the field of higher education that includes both the global idea of higher education as a field and the very minute social interactions, perhaps even of two people at a time. How do larger social networks that institutions respond to connect to these small social moments that a student might experience while they're on campus? So actor network theory, as you all have read about, ironically and appropriately comes from the study of technology. Physical artifacts like buildings and materials are considered by actor network theorists to be equally as important as people. We don't necessarily take it that far in the conversation that I'm having today, but it does expand on the social from a different perspective. Actor network theory is really not a theory, as we learned about in the article, but it is an overarching approach to thinking about social interactions. Similar to the way that constructivism changed the way that we think about learning, actor network theory changes the way that we think about social integration by changing the way that we think about social. When we think of the university as an actor network, we pay attention to everything: students, faculty, staff, the buildings, the processes like filling out papers, submitting grades, the other ways that other networks intersect with our world on campus. The security gate is an example of the intersection of larger issues of safety and society and processes of education. All of these elements are created equally. Earlier today, we talked about the university as a community. The theoretical framework I'm using today complicates this image and makes it more dynamic. So how do we study a heterogeneous elements in a network? The general idea of this fieldwork is similar to that used in Nesper's Knowledge in Motion, which you read. Nesper's research on undergraduate physics and business majors included interviews and meetings with administration and faculty, as well as loosely structured interviews and observations of the students, both in formal academic and informal student spaces. He also analyzed transcripts and other documents pertinent to his study. Using similar techniques, the purpose of the engineering study was to investigate the ways in which engineering education is gendered and how social constructions affect women's success in the field, highlighting ways women who are successful in the program, in a college engineering program, which we defined as persistent through the third year, negotiate their identities as women, as college students, and as engineers in the making. I have to reiterate the purpose of this particular research project was not to assert sweeping generalizations about persistence in engineering, but more to try to understand how this idea of actor network theory helps us recognize how integration happens. Integration being a key element of retention theory. In most student retention studies, the unit of analysis has been the individual. We're suggesting using the social, physical, and institutional environment for an effective means of researching retention and integration. Today, we'll look specifically at examples of the ways that students become engineers in order to demonstrate the ways that social network theory helps us understand or unpack social integration. According to Michel Calonne, there are 4 phases or translations within actor network theory. The first is problematization, the process of recognizing shared characteristics of those within the network and separating those from outside the network. That's a very, very simple explanation of a very much more complicated idea. Problematization requires process-oriented gateways or obligatory passage points students must pass through in order to achieve appropriate social identities. So let's think about what would be an obligatory passage point for a student who wants to become an engineer. Well, one cannot achieve the identity of an engineer without passing through engineering education. And within engineering education, there are additional steps students must take to successfully move from engineers in the making to professional engineers. You can imagine the simple step of needing to pass Calculus 2, or being able to complete your first year design course. Those are obligatory passage points designed in the curriculum for somebody who wants to get an engineering degree, and you have to have an engineering degree to become a professional engineer. So that helps us understand what an obligatory passage point might look like. But more abstractly, the perceived elite status of engineering is another way that engineering as a network binds and secures its memberships. When students are admitted into engineering programs, they are admitted into the club, as it were. As with any case of problematization, the boundaries of membership are recognizable from the outside as well as the inside. For example, we had a student that was interviewed who was majoring in both electrical engineering and Spanish. And she describes an interaction she had with her Spanish professor that really stood out for her. She said, I had a meeting with my professor about a presentation I had to do. And the professor said, oh yeah, you're the engineer and the brainiac in the class. The student took it as a compliment. She felt like if you don't take that kind of thing as a compliment, then you just hurt yourself. As she put it, I'm sure she didn't mean anything, calling her a brainiac. She recognized that it was something that outsiders said about engineering students, and it was something that she felt pride in as an engineering student because it meant that she was part of kind of a smart, nerdy club. It made her feel more like being part of the club. While there is an impression that engineers are the cream of the crop among college students, there's no measurable differences between those in engineering and those in engineering and those outside of engineering. The implications of some kind of recognized superiority is not lost on engineering students. For example, a senior male mechanical engineering student compared engineering to a medical degree. He said, I think one of the differences in engineering is as a profession It's a professional field, like being a doctor. Not to be an elitist, he said, but I think everyone in engineering is, although I don't want to say it, more mature. They take things to a more professional level. Engineers are elitist. 90% of us engineers think our major is better than any other undergraduate major. This message that we heard in a couple of different ways in the interviews points out that engineering superiority is one of the abstract kinds of ways that notion of superiority is in and of itself an actant that serves to create the network of engineers. It reinforces a group idealization and insider privilege. But the women in our study also pointed out that that notion of elitism and superiority is masculine. It's a male club. The lack of recognition of females as insiders in that club begins the process of gendered marginalization in the field that we found throughout our study. When a closer look is taken at gender in engineering, being female is tantamount to being an outsider of the network, no matter how nerdy you are or how much you try to become a member of the group. The second translation moment is intéressement. I say it in the French way because I have no idea how to say it in the English way. Intéressement is the process which assists in stabilizing a network. These are moments of strategies structured to stabilize and secure members with appropriate identities as part of the network, while keeping others on the outside. For example, when the College of Engineering is physically situated on campus, or where the College of Engineering is physically situated, requires students to intentionally go into those buildings, the same way that Nesper found in his study. Engineering buildings are not places students would randomly walk into. The difficulty of the engineering curriculum also leads to alliances among the engineering students and separations from their non-engineering peers. In contrast to her major with those of the classmates in her general education classes, one student stated, "I could get at least 9 degrees in other majors without even really trying. If they would only stop whining. I thought they just really needed to study. You have to work hard to make it. I was so angry," she's in about her gen ed class, "because I'm thinking I know more than half these kids in here who are smoking pot and sleeping in class." The engineering students' understanding, accurate or not, remember this is a process by which they are establishing a social. So it's not about truth or lies or exaggerations or reality. It's about the process of creating a social group. Their understanding, whether it's accurate or not, is that they are that they are the only serious students on campus with the hardest major, not only because of the tough curriculum, and it is tough, but because the answers on their tests really matter. Another student said, "My other classes were much less stressful than my engineering classes, because in those classes, I don't have to worry that if my design fails or my answer is wrong, people get hurt or killed." She's a civil engineer. It does matter for an engineer to get it right if they're going to be building bridges. This difficult engineering curriculum serves as a catalyst for students to band together, though they do so in definitely gendered terms. Sorry. Okay, so this moves us on to enrollment, the process of becoming attached to the new networks within their discipline. Students must first detach from networks to which they already belong, intéressement, in order to become connected and attached, enrolled, to new networks within their discipline. Enrollment is important for stabilizing the membership within this network. This is similar to Tinto's concept of student integration. Students in the study described their shared connection in terms of sacrifice. Every student used the term sacrifice with the understanding that they were choosing to give up something or everything in order to persist towards getting their degree in engineering. The idea of sacrifice, the concept of sacrifice, in itself becomes an actant in the network that the students act upon in order to create this sense of social. Most of the sacrifices that they described centered on the lack of free time that they enjoyed or did not enjoy by the engineering majors. One fifth-year student aggrievedly stated, I'm never able to enjoy Thirsty Thursdays because I always have class on Friday morning that I need to prepare for. Many of the women described their strict study schedules in great detail. A female biosystems engineering senior stated, "There have certainly been times where I've had to sacrifice, and although it stinks at times, it's always worth it. I wouldn't say there are huge life-altering moments of sacrifice. You have to make decisions, and I would argue it's the constant daily decisions, the decision to stay home and study instead of going out to see a movie. And because of that, my social life is limited." Again, sacrifice. And maybe we have another concept here for the network, decisions to sacrifice. Although the men reported allowing time to experiment in having a social life outside of engineering, in contrast, the women did not have the same luxury. They reported not mingling outside of engineering as they felt they couldn't risk taking any time away from their studies. By creating and maintaining an exclusive status of engineering students and creating boundaries set within the network of engineering education, it's established who is an insider and who is an outsider. Once the boundaries are understood and the students are enrolled in this network of sacrifice and elitism, it's necessary to mobilize. The final translation. Mobilization happens when insiders are kept on the inside and outsiders on the outside through behaviors and practices of the network, such as study groups and other alliances. The network itself moves or mobilizes from one part of a network to another, and even crossing over and influencing other networks. This is where the networks start to nest and influence one another. Although the mechanisms by which engineering students are socialized into their major and profession were identified clearly by both men and women in the study, the women described an additional negotiation of the social network learning regarding how to belong as a woman in a male field. This was especially clear in the ways that the women described their presentation of self, their clothing, and the ways that they carried themselves, what they wore, how they did their hair, all these kinds of things. And they talked about the ways that their engineering identity, how they were confused about how to carry that identity into other places and to be accepted and to be able to show those practices in one network that get carried to another. For example, the isolating practices of study groups and co-op experiences, the kinds of networks that make up engineering as a field that only engineering students do. To go to a co-op interview, for example, men just throw on a tie. The women agonized over what they would wear. The way that they participate in academic groups. One woman said, "I use a little higher pitch with my voice, like acting like a damsel in distress, even though I'm not." Another woman said that she sometimes acted like an aggressive female. A man can be direct and he's the boss. And when a woman is direct, she's bossy. And we all know what that means. She's the bitch. But it's the only way to get the guys to do anything. Finally, the women talked about mobilizing some other aspects of their identity as women in a mother and nurturing role. Actually, I did it all for them because I didn't want the group to fail, and part of their grade was my grade. I just ended up doing it for them and was very stressed out, but I got it done, talking about working in a group. So the women struggled to find authentic identities in their academic groups, in their engineering study groups, and in the times that they had to go on co-op placements. And it created an alternative network where they used things like damsel in distress, the mother figure, the aggressive female, to excuse the expression, bitch, in order to try to establish themselves as women within this network of engineering education that didn't always work for them. So what did we learn from using this idea of network to examine the social itself instead of just thinking of individual students entering a separate and distinct social? Well, we know that engineering is gendered, but we didn't know that it was going to be gendered in exactly the same way. Engineers in the making, the male students, were in some ways automatically connected to the larger network of engineering. engineering students in the making, the women in the study, who were very, very good students, really struggled in connecting to the profession. Among engineering students, there's a larger solidarity of all engineers. The danger comes when it's realized that women are not moving along the same trajectory as the men. If the goal is to have an identity of engineer in the making, somewhere along the way, the women were mobilized and stuck in an alternative identity of engineering student in the making, one where they could have the female gender. They are highly successful as elite super students, often at the top of their class, but they're rarely enrolled and mobilized into the mechanisms of the larger engineering network, even though they participate in co-op experiences and internships. The male students were mobilized from the outset as members of a brotherhood, that club. They were connected with the larger engineering culture as comrades. The female students, while connected with each other, and they had a very tight female group, and in the end, like SWE, the Society for Women in Engineering, for example, they were separated from the larger community of engineering in pretty significant ways. So we learned that women are successful students. Their retention as students was not a problem. Graduating was not a problem. But successful mobilization into the profession, which is one of the things that engineering education really worries about, creating that pipeline to increase the number of female engineers, was just not happening. And we started to see moments in the network creation that help us understand why that happened. Some policy implications of this study must go beyond the campus gates when studying student success and student retention. These women were very successful students. In some ways, we're not talking about typical attrition problems at all. The problem is that, frankly, after graduation, these women will almost immediately feel like failures. With few exceptions, most of the women in this study would not succeed in the careers for which they had sacrificed so much. When we discuss retention research in general, we usually mean retention to degree. This research indicates that once we start looking at retention in the context of the discipline, retention to degree could mean attrition to the profession if retention means marginalization of subgroups. So returning to the larger conversation of how do we measure social integration, and what does integration mean, and into what kind of social? This very brief introduction and application of actor network theory demonstrates that by examining how students learn to become members of social organizations on the micro level, we can gain insights into broader social and institutional impacts. It's important to recognize that face-to-face interactions, however we want to measure them, are never just that. If we continue to understand more about the micro-level social transitions of students and how those micro-level social transitions are part of networks that condense and conflate the broad global social network into the microsocial, we'll be in a better position to act as network builders in creating stronger enrollment practices, enrollment with 1L. And we may learn more about how collegiate life as a context for integration is understood. By complicating and expanding the notion of social integration, we need to examine and question methods that don't get into the fine-grained analysis of face-to-face and social relations on the micro and macro scale. Let's ask the question, what are we measuring when we measure? If we're dealing with a simple form of academic/social integration, then some of the questions won't matter. But if we're complicating it theoretically, then we have to complicate our methods by questioning them and looking for alternative methods. Thanks a lot. That'll about wrap it up. If anybody wants to have more conversations about this translation thing, just let me know. We can set up a chat. Talk to you soon. Bye.